What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion on this Thursday afternoon here on EWTN Radio. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you've got a question about the Catholic faith, we are here for you. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening in Jerusalem, please dial 1 and then 205-271-2985. And of course, you can always text the letters EWTN to 58177. Wait for our response, then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. Or if you prefer, send us an email. The address for that, ctc@ewtn.com. All right, Charles Beery is our producer. Matt Kabinski is our phone screener. Rich Jesse is handling social media for us. If you would like to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, we're streaming on both those platforms right now. Just put your question in the comments box if you would. Rich will see it. He'll grab it. He'll copy-paste it and send it to us here in the studio. Hopefully we can get that on today's program. Again, that phone number, 833-288-EWTN. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
I'm very well. How are you, sir?
Oh, I'm doing decent. Thank you.
I won't ask you about your lunch. What did you have for dinner last night? Because you've told us that your lunches tend to be pretty much copy-paste, 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 but dinners are a little different.
Well, actually, dinner was a wash last night because I had to leave home at like 4:45 to make it to an award ceremony for my high school students. So let's see, the night before then,
yes,
you know, it would have been what was it? It was sweet potatoes and asparagus and Indian dal.
Ooh.
And what else did I have? I had a whole smorgasbord of vegetables and dishes that were quite delicious, and topped it off with medjool dates and mission figs for dessert.
Wow, fantastic. Okay, well, there you go. I'm glad that I asked. Here's an interesting question from Carol listening to us on The Quest in Atlanta. This is very timely. She sent this morning, and as you know, today is the feast day of St. Athanasius. Carol says, in today's Magnificat, I read this quote from St. Athanasius, God was made man so that we might be made God. This has always bothered me. We can become God? This doesn't sound right to me. I'm not God. Can you please explain? And that's from Carol.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the question. So the doctrine comes from sacred Scripture, especially 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4, where the apostle tells us that through the promises of Christ, we can become participants in the divine nature. So how does that work out? Well, you know, the Apostle Paul has a rather detailed theology of our conformity to the person of Jesus. So the work of redemption is nothing other than shaping and changing our character so that we become more and more like Christ. And in doing so, we become more and more ourselves. We become more and more deeply human. That the incarnation is a restoration of what was lost in Adam, namely the likeness and image of God that was implanted in us by creation but deformed by sin. And so redemption through Christ is really becoming more and more what God designed us to be, which is in his own very image. You know, not that we are personally identical to God, as if we're, you know, like drops of water submerged into the ocean or something, but really coming to reflect that divine image that we're supposed to have from our creation. That means ultimately having the mind of Jesus, coming to see the world through Christ's eyes, regarding the poor and the destitute and the marginalized with the kind of love and compassion that he had, and being able to say no to self and offer our lives as a sacrifice for love of neighbor and love of God. That's really what is entailed in the transformation. And we're talking here about having a divine character imprinted on our life so that we become God-like, Christ-like, again, restoring that likeness and image. But not some sort of monistic notion where, you know, at death you sort of merge with the one and the absolute and cease to have any individuality. That's not the Christian doctrine at all.
Very good. And Carol, thanks for listening to us on The Quest in Atlanta. Very thoughtful question from Jeff, who is watching us on YouTube this afternoon. Jeff says, do you think a lot of quietly convinced Protestants may not convert because they would have to leave either their careers, as in pastors, or communities behind?
So here's what I think. I think that people often confront challenges to their worldview, to their community, to their doctrine, and that make them uncomfortable, can experience a kind of cognitive dissonance. And most of the time, people, including me, we will go way out of our way to reduce or eliminate that cognitive dissonance. And that can include suppressing our knowledge of the thing that caused the dissonance in the first place, or finding some way to discount it. And I can remember, I'm not going to name any names, but there's a Protestant minister who leads a national apostolate that would be known in evangelical circles, certain circles, not known to many Catholics. And because this guy's still in business, I'm not going to say his name.
Okay.
But I met with him. This was years ago when I was thinking of becoming Catholic, and actually, it was before I was thinking of becoming Catholic. And I asked this guy, I said, well, where do you go to church? And he said, well, I go to such and such a denomination, but I'm thinking of becoming Catholic. And it was like somebody hit me between the eyes with a 2x4.
Wow.
I'd never heard of something so crazy in all my life. Up until that point in my life, I had never thought about becoming Catholic. Even though my Protestantism was starting to dissolve, Catholicism hadn't presented itself to me as a live option. And when the guy said this, I thought, wow, you can do that. Like that's actually a thing you could do. I didn't consider it. And I began to think through what would happen if I became Catholic, and I began to realize that it would resolve a lot of my theological problems. Hadn't occurred to me before. And I kept up a correspondence with this guy, and he sent me some books in Catholic apologetics and so forth, and I was really starting to get interested. And then, I don't know, about 6 months in, he got cold feet and backed out. I went ahead and joined the church. He ended up backing out.
Wow.
And I don't know entirely what his motives were. I mean, he had a rationalization, but I couldn't help but notice that he was in an apostolate where his business would have collapsed overnight if he'd become Catholic. And, I don't want to accuse the guy of being dishonest, but I think a lot of us have a tendency to, if it's just too uncomfortable or too difficult to contemplate some possibility, we have a way of kind of rationalizing it away.
Well, there you go. And thanks so much, Jeff, for your question via YouTube. In a moment, we're going to be talking with Ann in Seattle. Also, Vivian in Massachusetts. Lisa is in Oklahoma. Still a couple lines open for you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to communion with Dr. David Anders on this Thursday afternoon on EWTN.
Family, during each day of May, let us sing the Magnificat with Mary, and let us begin each day by greeting her, our travel companion. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Help me to experience this day the Lord's nearness to me through you.
What is a patron saint? The classic professions such as soldiers or doctors have patron saints who represent the ideal of soldiering or doctoring. But we've lost the idea of patron saints because so many of the trades and crafts on which the modern world depends do not have an ideal figure. There's no patron saint of plumbers. G.K. Chesterton says there should be. It would be a revolution, for it would inspire each individual plumber to consider that there really was once a perfect being who did actually plumb. Well, Chesterton says, keep before your eyes the supreme adventure of virtue. If you are brave, think of the man who was braver than you. If you are kind, think of the man who was kinder than you. That is what is meant by having a patron saint.
Spend more time with the Apostle of Common Sense. Visit chesterton.org for more information.
This is Bishop Robert Barron. Join us as we discuss the truth, goodness, and beauty of Catholicism on the Word on Fire show, Sunday afternoon, 4 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
This is EWTN Catholic Radio.
It's Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on this beautiful Thursday afternoon here on EWTN Radio. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. Two lines open, 833-288-3986. Hey, you can discover the beauty, truth, and goodness of the Church with the EWTN online learning series. You can delve into the riches of the faith and grow closer to our Lord with free videos and study guide. EWTN invites you to be still and sit with the Lord through a wonderful program called In His Sandals, our online video reflections with our own chaplain, Father Joseph Mary Wolf. Check it out. Enroll in our courses today by going to learningseries.ewtn.com. Did I mention it's free? learningseries.ewtn.com. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. Here is Ann to lead us off, a first-time caller from Seattle, listening on the great Sacred Heart Radio. Hello, Ann. What's on your mind today? Ann in Seattle, are you there?
Yes, sorry about that. I am. I'm calling with a question specifically to practices of penance that the saints did, and especially those that involved self-flagellation or those kind of things. I'm wondering how we're to understand that. If I know that it's not understood as prescriptive, but I'm wondering if it's something that is now condemned, and therefore their acts should be seen as improper, even though they eventually became saints.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So, extreme penances have been part of Catholic tradition, along with not extreme penances, for 2,000 years. And when you read reports of the Desert Fathers, for example, you will sometimes find some really extraordinary levels of abnegation, and it was really lionized throughout the tradition, and people are regarded as, kind of heroes against the powers of the flesh and so forth. So that part of the tradition definitely exists. Folks that undertake extreme fasts or live in solitude and run around wearing hair shirts or taking vows of silence, or, there are all different kinds of ascetic practices, up to and including self-flagellation from time to time. Now, in the 14th century, these self-flagellation business really kind of got carried away, and there was an apocalyptic group called the Flagellants, the Flagellantes.
Wow.
That everybody was sort of worked up about the Black Death, the Great Plague, and thought the world was going to end any day, and seemed to be ending all around them, and they were keen to divert the wrath of God, and so they would go out in mass and run around through the cities gathering disciples and beating each other to bleeding. And it was a kind of frenzied mayhem, often associated with an anti-clerical and apocalyptic theology. And needless to say, the hierarchy did not look kindly upon that and tended to suppress it, and a number of actions were taken against the Flagellantes. Now, in the development of Catholic spiritual theology, which is really the heart of the Church's thinking about growth and holiness, asceticism definitely has a role, but extreme acts of asceticism have generally been frowned on by, great thinkers like St. Augustine of Hippo, for example, or St. Jerome, or Bernard of Clairvaux, or you name it. Especially the mystics like Teresa and John, you'll find this kind of thing is generally frowned upon. Because the risk of a person becoming neurotic about it is just way too high. And the goal of Christian spirituality is to obtain a sound mind, right? To attain the virtue that the ancients called apatheia, dispassion, being detached from, not just from your appetites, but from your whole bodily nature need not control you. And there's a kind of obsession that can take hold of a mind that is engaged in that kind of activity where you're really not free at all. See, freedom is the idea so that you can give yourself in charity and in love. That's what Augustine's whole emphasis was on. And he criticized the kind of monk who would take pride in his ability to undergo great penances and forget the fact that he was proud, which is why Benedictine spirituality, which really is the heart of the monastic tradition in the West, is such a sane, balanced, almost vanilla kind of approach to the Christian life that emphasizes obedience and humility and life in community and the simple practices of work and prayer as the path to growth and holiness rather than these fantastic flights. Now, you don't have to be a Christian. You don't have to have grace to perform extraordinary acts of physical endurance and abnegation. I mean, I have a son who's an MMA fighter, and they're all about blood and guts flying everywhere. And he got taken a few years back with this Dutch sensationalist named Wim Hof, who has all these records for burying himself in ice for hours upon end.
Wow.
He's climbed mountains like snow-covered mountains wearing nothing but a pair of running shorts. And ancient Roman soldiers used to do that kind of thing. And initiation into the cult of Mithras, they would go lie out on the ice. And so, you can do that kind of thing with a sort of soldiery fortitude, and a sort of let's grin and bear it determination. It's far from the kind of docility of soul and heart that leads to Christian charity.
Anne, is that helpful for you?
It is, but can I just ask, just because it was part of a Bible study question, actually, that we're just trying to know, like, for certain, does the Catholic Church condemn, say, like St. Catherine's, binding of the rope around
Sure. No, there's no categorical condemnation of any particular act of penance, but there is a caution in prudence that a person shouldn't undertake these kinds of things except under obedience to a wise spiritual director. And even then, very rarely, because it can so often be the sign of a deranged or unbalanced psychology, which is far from the goal of Christian spirituality.
And thanks so much for your call. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. Couple lines open for you. 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this Thursday afternoon here on EWTN. Let's go now to Vivian in Massachusetts, listening on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Hi, Vivian. What's on your mind today? Vivian, are you there?
Hello.
Yeah.
Yes,
go.
I am. Yes, I am. My question is, I know the souls in purgatory cannot pray for themselves, but can they pray for the other souls in purgatory?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So the one thing we know about the spiritual progress of souls in purgatory is that they cannot merit. So their prayers, or if good works, if they have them, are not meritorious. They don't earn a recompense from God. Our actions done in the state of grace are meritorious. God rewards them. The souls in purgatory do not merit. Whatever merit they have already earned on earth. They're not going to add to that in purgatory. So purgatory is just penitential and purifying. There's no more merit going on. Now, most Catholic theologians do believe the souls in purgatory can pray. In fact, that since they love God, they almost certainly are in communion with Him and some sort of communion of prayer. But God's response to their prayers would be one of just pure mercy and benevolence. It wouldn't be one of recompense or merit. Whether they can pray for one another, when we pray for the souls of the dead, we can, for example, have a Mass said for their souls. Now, the Mass is intrinsically meritorious, and so it has an efficacy there for the souls in the dead that souls in purgatory would not have. So I don't know that there's any teaching of any theologian that says that they can't, but the way that they function, the way they would work in the redemption of such souls or the purification of such souls would be very different from the kind of effect the prayers of the faithful on earth, the church militant, would have when praying for the dead.
Vivian, thank you so much for your call. Still a couple lines open for you at 833-288-EWTN if you have a question for Dr. David Anders. 833-288-3986. Let's go to Lisa now. Lisa is in Oklahoma, also listening on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Lisa, what's on your mind today?
Yes, I wanted Dr. Anders, thank you for taking my call, first of all, but I wanted Dr. Anders' opinion on a situation. My husband and I are fairly recent converts to the faith. Our son and daughter-in-law are not Catholic. Our son left our daughter-in-law in the middle of her RCIA and coming into the church. She was received into the church, and they ended up divorcing about 3 months later civilly, and then he has recently decided that he wants to reconcile with her. But to us, he has expressed that the reason that he is not so much that he's in love with her, is that he thinks it's the moral thing to do, and his father and I have pressured him into this because we believe it's the right thing to do to save a marriage. But I just want Dr. Anders' opinion if, our faith, his faith that God can make her lover, is this the right thing to do?
Okay, let me ask you a couple of questions. I appreciate this, by the way. Thank you. So, son and daughter-in-law, she has since become Catholic. Were they baptized Christians at the time of their marriage?
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to presume the sacramentality of their marriage. The question of the validity of their marriage will only be raised if one of them applies for an annulment. So if she, for example, applies for an annulment, she might very well be granted the annulment. But if she doesn't ask, no one's going to investigate, and the church always presumes the validity of the sacrament. So for now, we're going to assume that their marriage is valid. Okay? Now, what is your obligation in a valid marriage? Well, it's to maintain conjugal living. I promise to love, honor, and cherish you, to have and hold, sickness, health, better, worse, rich, poor, you name it, till death do us part, period, end of paragraph. The civil divorce doesn't have p-turkey to do with that, except that it seems to be a violation of that vow, but it doesn't make them not married. A civil divorce doesn't separate what God has joined together. And so, it happens quite frequently that husbands and wives have become alienated from one another in more or less severe ways. And if possible, the proper thing to do is definitely to reconcile. So that's everything that you've said thus far is correct. Okay. Now, here are a couple of caveats. Here are the caveats. First of all, I get a really queasy feeling in the stomach from the son who says, well, I'm just doing this for you, Mom and Dad. That really gives me a queasy feeling in the stomach, because that doesn't sound like a man who is committed to reconciliation because it's the right thing to do. He seems to be offloading the moral judgment to somebody else, which gives him an out down the road to say, you made me do this, and to blame y'all when he's not willing to make the proper sacrifices and he divorces her all over again. Or worse, well, maybe not worse, but similarly, maybe he bears a grudge against her and against you for the next 30 years of his life. Okay, now, all of that is not a reason not to reconcile, but it is a reason to have a really frank conversation and say, look, we hope you reconcile because it's the morally right thing to do. I don't care really p-turkey right now how you feel about it, whether it makes you happy, whether it makes your toes tingle. But I will tell you, if you do this, you may never tell me that it's my fault when things go sour for you. You cannot hold that over my head. And for God's sake, you have to give up the right to resent your wife. Die to that right now. You are not some martyr to holiness that we all have to pity. And that's how you're setting this thing up. So get rid of that self-pity trip right now. If you're going to do this, you got to do it right, which is that you own the responsibility and you forego the right to be angry and bitter and blame other people. This is on your head, on nobody else's, and you got to come to terms with that. And if you think the right thing to do is to die to yourself and your passions and your desires and your plans and all your precious projects to serve somebody else, then you go do that. But don't ever tell us how morally decent you are for doing it. That is dead. That dies with yourself when you make this commitment. So that's what bothers me about the scenario. Now, if he's capable of doing that, well and good. All right. But if he nyas his way to the altar, then I would think the daughter needs to think seriously about the terms of reconciliation. She has to say yes to this. And she does not need to sign up to be a doormat, resented and despised for the next 50 years of her life. And needs to have a conversation about whether he's going to be an adolescent boy or if he's going to man up. And if he's not willing to man up, and if he comes, with all kinds of conditions and psychological manipulation, then if she were my daughter, I'd say, before you jump back in with this guy, you need to have a conversation about the possibility of an annulment. Right? Yes, it's the right thing to do to get married. Yes, the church presumes the validity of this sacrament. But I'm guessing if she asked for the annulment, she'd get it. And so she needs to think quite seriously about whether he is going to grow up and not just go through the motions, but genuinely like the moral transformations necessary and be committed to the kind of relationship that the church calls marriage in love before she agrees to let him make her a doormat again.
Lisa, thanks so much for your call. We hope that is helpful for you. We'll certainly keep your family in our prayers. David, I think you were channeling your dad as I'm listening to you say this, because your dad, when somebody would come to him and say, well, I'm thinking about leaving my wife, he would say, don't do it.
Don't do it.
Just don't do it, period.
Yeah.
That's end of paragraph right there. Appreciate that. In a moment, we're going to talk with Renee, a first-time caller from Columbus. Also, Jason in Brick, New Jersey. Rick is calling in from Minnesota. Got lots more straight ahead on the second half of today's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. By the way, if you'd like to text us, text the letters EWTN to 58177. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Lots more straight ahead on the Thursday afternoon edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN.
This is Conversations with Consequences, where we delve deeper into issues affecting our church, our country, and our core, the family.
As Catholics, we need to be informed, aware, and able to talk through some of the tough topics that we're facing in our culture and in our world. Conversations with Consequences gives us the tools to do so.
It's not enough to pray. We have to be a light for the world.
Conversations with Consequences, this Saturday at 5 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Welcome to Catholic Blitz. Father Trujillo, you're in the hot seat.
Bring it on.
Okay, here's your question. Why was Mary assumed into heaven? You got 1 minute. Go.
Jesus missed her?
There you go. That's a good one. I like that.
We believe that at the end of her time here on earth, that Mary was assumed body and soul to heaven, first and foremost because that was a prefigurement of what would happen to us, God willing, that after our time here on earth ends, we believe in the resurrection of the dead, and the just will have their bodies and souls reunited, taken up to heaven. Now, Mary goes first as a prefigurement, but also because Jesus, not only being God, is also man. And what son would want to leave his mother behind if he could take her home with him? So our Lord basically is doing that as both God and man. As God, he's the one who assumes her. She did not ascend. She did not have divine power. Jesus ascended into heaven, body and soul. Mary was assumed. So Jesus is the one who took her up into heaven, body and soul.
Great job.
And come back again for more Catholic Blitz.
You can rely on the Catholic News Agency to provide trustworthy and timely news from a Catholic perspective, including social, political, moral, and cultural issues. For the latest Catholic news, visit CatholicNewsAgency.com.
Hi, this is Cy Kellett. Later today on Catholic Answers Live, Jimmy Aiken and Mark Brumley join us for Ask Me Anything. Catholic Answers Live, 6 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. Now, back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Congratulations going out to 2 more members of our EWTN radio family. KHQR, that is FM 99.9 in Harlingen, Texas, celebrating 6 years with EWTN, and St. Paul Catholic Radio in Augusta, Georgia, and McCormick, South Carolina, marking 12 years with us. And one more thing here before we get back to the phones, and that is regarding the Station of the Cross. Our friends along the East Coast, they need to hear from you next week. Station of the Cross airing their spring appeal, and that'll be starting on Monday. So if you're listening in Boston or Buffalo or Syracuse, Rochester, or anywhere, remember to support our friends at the Station of the Cross and your EWTN Catholic radio station. All right, back to the phones now for Renee, a first-time caller from Columbus, listening on the Blowtorch St. Gabriel Radio. Hello, Renee. What's on your mind today?
Well, hi. Well, thanks for taking my call. I love this show. My question is around cremation, and my understanding is the church allows Catholics to be cremated. However, they can't have their ashes scattered about. And my question is, if that's the case, then why do they have saints sometimes dispersed to different areas, different parts of their body? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it. Well, first of all, when you have a relic, the relics are placed within a reliquary for veneration. And so the form of their preservation and the purpose of their preservation points specifically to Catholic belief in the resurrection of the body, that the relics of the saints are basically Christ distributed through his members, and our belief in the dignity of the body and the resurrection of the dead. And the practice of scattering ashes typically proceeds from a very different theological vision of the destiny of human persons and the nature of the body. I mean, ultimately, you find something like the Hindu belief in the transmigration of souls and basically the meaninglessness of the body. The body is just sort of a temporary vehicle, like a taxi cab that takes you from one incarnation to the next, and a view of redemption that really doesn't look to the resurrection of the body and certainly not to union with Christ. And that's why when the church talks about cremation, it says you're allowed to cremate unless you do so for a superstitious reason, because it understands that there are superstitious reasons to cremate, reasons that would not proceed from a Christian understanding of the body. Such things, however, could never be said about the veneration of relics, which is deeply connected to Christian views of redemption.
There you go. Renee, thanks so much for your call today. A big day around EWTN because if you remember, back in the day, May 2nd, 1987 was the day that Mother Angelica founded the Franciscan Missionaries of the Eternal Word. So today marks the 37th anniversary for this. She founded the community on the feast day of St. Athanasius, Doctor of the Church, known as the Church's greatest defender of the incarnation of the Eternal Word, which is what EW stands for within EWTN, Eternal Word Television Network. So congratulations to all of our friends there, the Friars and the Brothers. What a wonderful community that really is. All right, let's go now to Jason. Jason is listening to us, a first-time caller in Brick, New Jersey, on the great Domestic Church Media. Hey, Jason, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hi, so I was wondering, my understanding of Protestant theology is that they believe that basically the Bible is the only source of truth. So I was just wondering how they explain the fact that the Bible doesn't address every one of their day-to-day issues, and is this perhaps an advantage of the Catholic Church?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. I am deeply sympathetic to your criticism of the Protestant doctrine of the Bible alone. However, I do think we have to be fair to the Protestant position and articulate it for what it is. The Protestant doctrine generally is not that the Bible contains everything that there is to know, or even everything that you need to know, but rather everything that you need to know for salvation. That as far as one's relationship with God and the moral life is concerned, the Bible contains everything you need to know. Now, I think that's false. I don't believe it's true. But I mean, a Protestant wouldn't look to the Bible, for example, to learn how to change the oil in his car. There are all kinds of things that they would recognize you can learn from the natural world, and those things have some utility for life in this world, but they would say that that's not really relevant for life in the next. So there are other criticisms you can bring against the Protestant doctrine of the Bible alone. So I'll list some of them. Right? One of the most important ones is that the doctrine itself is not taught in the Bible. Now, the whole idea of the Bible alone is that Christians shouldn't admit any Christian doctrine that can't be found in the Bible or can't be established from Scripture. And so Scripture alone fails its own test because the Bible never says that you have to have everything out of the Bible. So it's self-refuting, self-contradictory. In addition, not only does the Bible not proclaim its own sufficient authority, but it gives us a different rule of faith. Instead of pointing us to the Bible alone, the Bible points us to the teaching authority of the church as our rule of faith. So Jesus in Matthew 28 says to the apostles, "Go into all nations, make disciples, teach them everything I've commanded you, and I'll be with you to the end of the age. Whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. Whoever hears you hears me." So if you want to know the teaching of Christ, you turn to the teaching of the church, which is offered to us by authorized human beings, not by a text. And that comes with the promise of divine assistance. So the Bible gives us a different rule of faith, doesn't give us the Bible alone. There are other problems with the doctrine of sola scriptura. Here's another biggie. Based on the idea of the Bible alone, there is no principled way for a Protestant or anyone else to distinguish dogma from opinion. Well, what do you mean, Anders? Well, a dogma are those things that all Christians have to agree on. Most Protestants would say, well, you better agree on the doctrine of the Trinity, or you have to agree on, say, the Bible alone, or you have to agree on the divinity of Christ or something. Those are dogmas. Opinions are issues upon which Christians can legitimately disagree without breaking fellowship from one another. Even if you believe that the Bible can tell you the truth about God and the moral life, when Christians disagree, there is no way to determine whether the disagreement is substantive or not. And Protestants have no way of negotiating that problem. So I'll give you an example. In the 16th century, just about every Protestant thought that the nature of Christ's presence in the Eucharist was an issue worth dividing over. Worth dividing over. Today, almost no Protestant thinks that, except maybe some Lutherans. Now, there's still disagreement about the nature of the Eucharist. That's not the point at issue. They disagreed then, they disagree now. The point I'm making is that they no longer care as much about the disagreement. What changed? Nothing. Only time and culture. It's not that the Bible suddenly, the texts about the Eucharist went from like bold flashing letters to faded gray. It's the same text. Their cultural situation changed, and therefore their assessment of what matters changes. And you'll find that dynamic across the whole range of Protestant doctrine. The Bible doesn't give you a principled way to answer that question. I know Plymouth Brethren Protestants that really, really think Paul meant it in 1 Corinthians 11 when he said that women can't talk in church and have to cover their heads. And others that think that's just an absolutely absurd criteria to bring forward for Christian worship. And they have no way to resolve whether their disagreement matters or not. Right? So that's a big problem with Sola Scriptura. Here's another really big problem with the doctrine of Sola Scriptura. What's the Bible? What is this book that's supposed to give us the basis of Christian faith and practice? What is it? What constitutes it? What books fall within it? What is the list of biblical books in the canon? Does the Bible tell us? No. The Bible does not come with an inspired table of contents. And in fact, throughout sacred history, Protestants have proposed and Christians have proposed different lists of biblical books. They're not all the same. Which one's the one you consult? The Bible doesn't tell you. Only way you can have access to a list of books that you call Scripture is by reference to sacred tradition. If you throw out the authority of sacred tradition, you have to throw out the authority of the canon. And so you can't appeal to a book that you can't identify. The Bible's our rule of faith, if we can figure out what it is. So there are all kinds of reasons why the doctrine of Sola Scriptura, I think, is just an incoherent mess. And it arose not because of some detailed consideration of the nature of divine revelation, but out of polemical necessity. Because John Eck pushed Martin Luther to the wall in 1519 at the Leipzig debate and said, Luther, your teachings have already been condemned by church councils. And so Luther thought, well, I got no alternative. Well, I guess I'll reject councils and I'll stand on the Bible alone. It was just a rhetorical move forced on him by polemical necessity, not something that the Bible itself taught.
Jason, appreciate your call. Thanks for bringing it to us. And here is Rick now in Minnesota, listening on the great Real Presence Radio. Hey, Rick, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hello?
Hi.
I already asked. I thought I was waiting in line.
You're next on the air. What's on your mind today?
Oh, I thought I went through the screeners. I was going to ask. The question was this: is not the underlying theology of natural family planning per se not Roman Catholicism, but actually atheism?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So, as I understand it, natural family planning is not a philosophy. It's a technique for avoiding pregnancy. And it is consistent with any number of philosophical positions. So atheists could avoid pregnancy by not having sex. Catholics could avoid pregnancy by not having sex. They would probably do so for different reasons.
Yes.
But they were both capable of abstaining from sexual relations to avoid pregnancy.
Rick, thanks so much for your call. Tonight on The World Over with Raymond Arroyo, pundits Tudor Dixon and Mercedes Schlapp join Raymond to talk about the 2024 presidential race. Oh, my. Also, Father Roger Landry, Columbia University chaplain, discussing the pro-Palestinian demonstrations at his university this week. That should be fascinating right there. Newsmax host Todd Starnes talks about his new book, and CEO Neil Alston talks about the Christian prayer app Abide. Get news from the world over in your email inbox every week. Visit EWTN.com, click on the word subscribe. Again, the world over tonight, that's at 8 p.m. Eastern on EWTN radio and television. Here is Kay now. Kay is in Ohio and listening on Sirius XM channel 130. Kay, what's on your mind today?
Oh, hi. Yesterday I was listening to that deacon, I can't think what his name is, show when I was driving home. And he kept talking about St. Joseph is the foster father, the foster. And it's like, no, you cannot be a foster father. That's a temporary situation. You would either be an adopted father or you'd be a stepfather. And I was perplexed as to why he kept saying, and he said it so many times, that I called in, but they said I called into the wrong show. And they said to call today or Father Mitch, one of you two, because it just was perplexed. It doesn't make sense that you refer to him as father.
Sure. I have no problem with what you just said. And if you want to call St. Joseph his adopted father or his stepfather, fine by me. I mean, these terms are not really deeply embedded in the Catholic tradition. I mean, this is just one interpreter's way to try to capture the relationship between Jesus and Joseph, who was not his biological father. And maybe he used an infelicitous turn of phrase, a word drawn from the English language in our modern sort of social work context that didn't exist in antiquity. And if you think that's inadequate, propose another one, that's fine.
Sure. Kay, thanks so much for your call. By the way, that was Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers on his new program, Beacon of Truth, which is heard on most of these EWTN stations at 4 p.m. Eastern Time each and every weekday. Here is John in Kansas City listening on the great Catholic Radio Network. Hey, John, what's on your mind today, sir?
Daniel chapter 6. I think that Daniel chapter 6 be read more often, at least 3 times a year, on Divine Mercy Saturday, Thanksgiving Day, and the Queen's Sip of Mary. Thank you very much for taking my call.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Daniel 6. Why isn't Daniel 6 read more often than just a couple times a year?
Oh, sure. Well, it's a pretty big Bible. You're trying to get most of it in there. You can't get, you have to kind of be selective in what days you assign. I mean, if we read Daniel 6 every day of the week, we wouldn't have time for all the rest of it. Now, Daniel 6 is the story of Daniel in the lion's den. I didn't grow up in the Catholic Church. I grew up in the Protestant Evangelical Church. And as a kid, I thought there hardly was anything in the Bible other than Daniel chapter 6. Daniel, Joseph and his brothers, Noah's Ark, and the Exodus were pretty much my limit of biblical knowledge. Tom, I don't know if you had the experience, probably didn't, of flannel graphs. Do you have any?
I know what they are.
Experience with flannel graphs?
I do, yeah.
In the evangelical world, for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds, flannel graphs were all the rage in the 1970s. There were these flannel boards and little cartoon cutouts of biblical characters that had flannel on the back, and flannel sticks to flannel. And so the Sunday school teacher would have the Bible stories up there and stick them on the board and illustrate. You'd have Joseph, sort of walking across the flannel, and here come his brothers, and they leap on him and throw him in the well, and off he goes to Egypt. You'd have the whole thing laid out for you. So my entire biblical imagination from childhood consisted of, selling your siblings into slavery, watching Daniel not be eaten by a bunch of really friendly-looking lions, all of which were plastered on a flannel graph.
On a flannel graph.
Yeah.
Well, the big thing, my understanding about is from the 1970s would have been, for Catholics, it would have been banners. Banners hanging all over the church. And a friend of mine, a priest friend, took over this church. He walked into the church and looked around. He said, "I've got a great idea. Let's take all these down. I don't think we need these."
One thing on the Joseph story, though, while I'm on Old Testament tales, when my oldest sons were like 3 or 4 years old, I got to teach them the Bible, so I got a hold of one of these Bible story books for kids, and I read them the story of Joseph and his brothers, and the multicolored coat, and they throw Joseph in the pit, and they sell him off into slavery, and all the rest of it, and I finished the story, and I turn and I asked him, what do you guys think of that? And Jonathan, my oldest, was, he was 3. And then Joshua, his little brother, was 2. And Jonathan turns and he looks at his 2-year-old brother. He gets this malicious look in his eyes and he yells, "Throw him in the well!"
It's great stuff. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Paul is in Georgia, checking us out via podcasting today. Hello, Paul. What's on your mind today, sir? Or ma'am? Paul, are you there?
Yes.
Go right ahead.
Hey, I'm in Lilburn, Georgia, and I'm calling for the 5th grade class of St. John Newman Regional Catholic School. They have 2 questions for Dr. David Anders to help them understand their faith better. The first one is, who created God? The second one is, why did God create us with free will, but then we also have this suffering and suffering and evil? And I will let Dr. Anders answer the question, and I will get off the phone. You have a great day.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So I would come back and I would ask my fifth grade friends something like the following. So you can line up 5 apples, 5 bananas, 5 houseplants, 5 chihuahuas, any collection of 5 things that you want. And you can say, well, here are the 5 things, they really exist. God made them. But let's say there were no houseplants, there were no chihuahuas, and there were no bananas, and there was no material thing in existence at all. Would you say in consequence that 5 didn't exist? Well, that's kind of hard to wrap your head around, right? I can think 5, derive all kinds of true things about 5, without there ever being 5 actual things. There's something about 5, or 4 for that matter, or 28, or the square root of 72, you name it, about numbers that they seem to be real in a sense, but they don't have any kind of material existence, and it doesn't seem to make sense to think about 5 beginning to exist or ceasing to exist. After all, if the whole universe vanished tomorrow, it's not like the Pythagorean theorem would stop being true in some possible universe. It would be out there someplace, but not in a thing, right? And the existence of God is more like the existence of numbers than it is like the existence of bananas. And God is not a thing. It's not a thing like a banana or a chihuahua that you can put your hand on that exists in a universe of other things. He's more like the way numbers exist, eternally, without change, but you can find them instantiated in particular objects without themselves ever being limited to or reduced to that. Now, here's the difference between God and numbers. All right, they both exist in that kind of immaterial way, but numbers are merely an abstraction, something that we seem to deduce from the logical relations that exist between things. This next concept may be a bit tough on 5th graders, okay? But I'm going to throw it out there anyway. The difference between, say, just the number 5 and 5 bananas is that the bananas actually exist, whereas they exist in a kind of a concrete way that 5 seems to exist in a more shadowy way, okay? There's some kind of, big word here, ontological means the nature of being. There's a kind of ontological chutzpah, kind of oomph in the banana that the number 5 lacks, right? And what is that? When I talk about existence, what is existence? What does it really mean? All right? And the Catholic position is that being, to be something, to be anything, can't not be. You can't think of there being an absolute nothingness from which somehow a something emerges, because out of nothing, nothing comes. God just is that undifferentiated, undivided, eternally simple act of being from which all particular beings derive their being. God is the being that beings have. That oomphness, that slap you in the faceness of the actual banana comes from someplace. That's what we mean by God. God is the act of being itself. And everything else has a participated existence. God has a necessary and absolute existence. So he doesn't start to exist. He doesn't cease to exist. He doesn't change. He's eternally the act of being. That's just what God is. That's what the word means. Why did God give us free will if he knew that evil would result? Well, because he intended to bring a greater good out of that evil. Jesus said there's more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner that repents than over 99 righteous people that has no need of repenting.
Paul, we hope that's helpful for you and for your class. Thanks for checking in today from Georgia. Here is Tom now, a first-time caller from Florida, watching us on YouTube. Hello, Tom. What's on your mind today, sir? Tom in Florida, are you there?
Yes.
Go right ahead.
I've been reading scripture, and I'm into Ecclesiastes, and Ecclesiastes is very confusing. And I get to chapter 9, verse, say, 1 to 3 or 1 to 4, and it says, among all these things that happen under the sun, this is the worst, that things all turn out the same for all. And I'm not sure if they're referring to just being dead physically or the afterlife.
Yeah, thanks. So the author of Ecclesiastes is a pessimist. He is a cynic. He's a skeptic. He doesn't know if there's a next life. He doesn't know if there's justice. He doesn't know if there's a God. And the course of human life around him strikes him as meaningless and absurd. And he is expressing all of that in poetry. The entire book, therefore, is a lament. It's a kind of lament for the existential absurdity of the human situation. He is, if you will, a French existentialist transported back to ancient Israel. Okay,
with a beret.
With a beret,
Okay.
Exactly.
All
With a yarmulke, maybe.
Yeah.
All right. And so you might ask yourself the question: well, what in heaven's name is that doing in the Bible? And what you find is that this sentiment is expressed in more than one place in the Bible. Ecclesiastes is one of them. I think my favorite has got to be Psalm 88. When the psalmist says many of the same things, but he's got more teeth to it because it's actually directed as a prayer to God. Like, God, where the heck are you?
Yeah.
Where the heck are you? My life is going to hell in a handbasket. My enemies are railed around me. All my friends have abandoned me. My one companion is darkness. The heck, men, right? I mean, and that's the whole psalm. There's no note of redemption in that psalm at all. It is just despair, right? Now, why would that be in the Bible? Why would the Holy Spirit inspire it? Why would the community put that in their sacred text and read it within the liturgy? And I think it's because this is an experience that everyone has, including very persuaded believers. If you've ever read the life of Thérèse of Lisieux, if you've read the diaries of Mother Teresa, you know both of them struggled quite explicitly with atheism. Not just doubt, but the concern that perhaps God did not in fact exist.
Ooh.
And that if he did exist, that he didn't think much of them. And that was what Mother Teresa said exactly. I feel like God is not there. And if he is there, he didn't like me. Now, the church calls her a saint. What do we do with that? Well, in the book of Isaiah, we learn that the servant of God can undergo extreme suffering, be rejected by friends and fellows and colleagues and countrymen and family, to the extent that people consider such a person even cut off by God and rejected by him and afflicted. Christ himself enters into this state of alienation, enters fully into the experience of human suffering, which includes this kind of existential suffering. The one interpretation of his cry from the cross validates that, right? Why? So that he can redeem the experience, come out the other end and find holiness and love. And there's a tradition in Catholic mystical theology that to really pass through the heart of darkness into charity, you have to have this kind of abandonment. You have to have this kind of operating in pure faith alone without any tangible or sensible awareness of God's presence. Only then can you die to yourself sufficiently that you can really take up the charge to love as Jesus loved.
Tom, thanks so much for your call. We got a great question from JJ on YouTube, but we don't have time to play it today or time to answer it today because here comes the music, so we'll do that on tomorrow's program. Dr. David Anders, thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Be sure to join us tomorrow for the Friday edition of Call to Communion. Until then, I'm Tom Price on behalf of Dr. David Anders. We will see you next time, hopefully tomorrow. God bless.
I'm Jeanette DeMello, Editor-in-Chief of the National Catholic Register, and together with Matthew Bunce and I co-host Register Radio, where every your light.